Thank you very much for showing up at the International Institute for Strategic Studies this morning. I am very happy, and we as an institution are very happy to welcome Frank Miller amongst us. Frank is a man of many distinctions, some of them even positive. He was the senior civil servant in the American Department of Defense. He was physically the embodiment of Anglo-American nuclear cooperation. And he has asked me to give him a very brief introduction, so I will, by saying that I worked for Frank for almost 5 years in the Bush White House. And in addition to running nuclear policy for the United States, he also ran a lot of the work of trying to salvage the Iraq War. And I say with real devotion to him that there would be more dead soldiers and civilians in the Iraq War, but for Frank Miller's careful, attentive efforts to mitigate problems. I admire him enormously. He is here this morning to fight the argument about the American Nuclear Posture Review that was just done. Franklin, over to you.
Thank you, Corey, and thanks all of you for braving the rain to be here. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be back at IISS after quite some time. So I'm really happy to be here to clarify what the 2018 Nuclear Posture Review calls for, and equally as important, what it doesn't call for, what it doesn't advocate. Because if one perused the spate of articles which emerged once a draft of the NPR was leaked in January, one might be forgiven for believing the following things. First, that the NPR represents a dangerous departure from long-standing U.S. deterrence policy, that it initiates a new nuclear arms race, that it proposes an unaffordable and unnecessary plan to modernize U.S. nuclear forces, that it creates a new class of so-called usable nuclear weapons, that it threatens nuclear retaliation for cyber attack, and that it abandons arms control efforts. And even post the publication of the real document, there have been some arguments made in Europe that include assertions that the NPR reverses previous U.S. policy of reducing the number and types of nuclear weapons in the U.S. arsenal by further diversifying that arsenal, and that it increases U.S. reliance on nuclear weapons. And none of these, and I repeat, none of these criticisms are accurate or valid. And so in my prepared remarks this morning, I want to make clear why they are based on misreadings, which are either deliberate or simply mistaken, misreadings of the NPR itself, a failure to understand or comprehend classic U.S. deterrence policy, and a disregard of how the international security picture has evolved and, in fact, deteriorated over the past decade. So first, let's deal with the spurious charge that the Nuclear Posture Review is creating a new nuclear arms race. Fact. The United States has not fielded a new nuclear system in the 18 years of this century. However, since 2008, Russia and China have been embarked, each of them, on major upgrades to their nuclear forces. Today, Russia is deploying, by which I mean putting in the field, 2 new types of intercontinental ballistic missiles, 3 new types of submarine-launched ballistic missiles, a new long-range air-launched cruise missile. Russia has reopened the Blackjack strategic bomber line. There are 3 new Russian SSBNs in the water, and Russia is also deploying a host of new dual-capable air, sea, and ground-launched cruise missiles. And it's also in the final stages of developing a follow-on to the SS-18 ICBM, which has long been regarded by the West, and publicly so, as a destabilizing system. China is deploying 2 new types of ICBMs and a new submarine-launched ballistic missile. There are 4 new SSBNs in the water, and it has the most dynamic ballistic missile program in the world. And as former U.S. Defense Secretary Ash Carter remarked, there is a nuclear arms race, but the United States is not in it. Second, the NPR does call for modernizing all 3 legs of the U.S. nuclear triad, essentially endorsing the previous administration's plan to do so. That said, no new U.S. systems will be fielded until at least the mid-2020s, which will be, as the commander of our strategic command says, just in time. By the mid to late 2020s, our bombers, strategic submarines, and land-based missiles will have been deployed well past the anticipated end-of-life dates for each system, and they will have to be retired or retired with or without replacement. Critics of modernization like to throw around a 30-year life cycle cost to produce a sticker shock for the program. This obscures 2 points, however. 30-year program costs always have a sticker shock. They're always large. Second, the cost of the modernization program, even when it's in full swing by the 2020s, is not expected to exceed 3 to 4% of the U.S. defense budget. And that's the defense budget before the sequester caps were lifted about a week and a half ago. The current operating costs of the deterrent run about 3% of the defense budget and will continue to do so. So the total cost of protecting America and its allies from nuclear attack is between 6 and 7% of the defense budget at any time between now and the 2030s. That's less than 1% of the federal budget, and it's not too much to pay for preventing an existential threat. Let's turn now to the allegation that the NPR is not consistent with long-standing U.S. nuclear deterrence policy. My answer is that it is squarely in the policy mainstream, but it's important to remind you that U.S. nuclear policy did not begin with NPR 1994, and certainly not with NPR 2010 and the Prague Initiative. The mainstream begins in the early years of the nuclear age. And from those early years to today, the fundamental policy is deterrence. Deterrence whose goal is to prevent nuclear or major non-nuclear attack on the United States and its allies. That's a constant, and you'll find it in the NPR. As uncomfortable as it may be for some, deterrence relies on presenting potential enemies with a certainty that U.S. retaliation will exact costs which exceed gains any aggressor hopes to make. That's a constant, and you'll find that in the NPR. Since 1949, targets have included a mix of so-called counterforce and counter-value systems. That's a constant, and you'll find that in the NPR. The policy provides the President of the United States with options. Since the 1960s, this has been explicitly in an effort to raise the nuclear threshold. The options are flexible, and since the 1970s, comprise both small and large potential responses. This is a constant, and you'll find that in the NPR. Since 1980, the policy and its options explicitly threaten what enemy leadership values. That's a constant. You'll find that in the NPR. There's a quote from the 1983 Scowcroft Commission, which if you substitute the word Soviet, if you substitute for that, just say potential enemy, it actually captures the notion. I quote, "Deterrence is the set of beliefs in the minds of the Soviet leaders, given their own values and attitudes, about our capabilities and our will. It requires us to determine as best we can what would deter them from considering aggression, even in a crisis," end quote. Deterrence is and has been for decades, therefore, tailored. It's dynamic, it's not static. As Secretary of Defense Weinberger wrote in 1982, "In order to deter successfully, our capabilities must change as the threat changes and as our knowledge of what is necessary to deter improves." You'll find that same theme in NPR 2018. The NPR relies on a triad, which has been the basis of our deterrent posture since the 1960s. Since the end of the Cold War, the United States has not sought to mimic or replicate or match Russian non-strategic forces. And you'll find that in the NPR. So the NPR is precisely where it should be, squarely in the mainstream of U.S. deterrence policy. Let's talk for a moment about arms control and nonproliferation. The NPR supports the NPT and commits the United States to help strengthen it. It maintains the U.S. moratorium on nuclear testing. But it also contains the following key phrases. First, I quote, "Arms control can contribute to U.S. allied and partner security by helping to manage strategic competition among states," close quote. At the same time, it also notes, I quote, "Progress in arms control is not an end in and of itself. It depends on the security environment and the participation of willing partners. Further progress is difficult to envision, however, in an environment characterized by nuclear armed states seeking to change borders and overturn existing norms, and by significant continuing non-compliance with existing arms control agreements and commitments." End quote. When the NPR was being drafted, we were aware that Russia is violating the Helsinki Final Act, the Budapest Accord, the Istanbul Agreement, the Presidential Nuclear Initiatives of 1991 and 1992, the Open Skies Treaty, the Vienna Document, and the INF Treaty. And now, as Britain is acutely aware, and also the rest of the world, we know that Russia is violating the Chemical Weapons Convention. It is difficult, to put it mildly, to do business with a government that so blatantly violates its international commitments and lies about it. We should be quite clear. International agreements are intended to be honored by their signatories. That is the point of negotiating such agreements. When one party continually violates the agreements it has signed without penalty, it establishes a pattern that undercuts the value of treaties generally and discredits the entire practice of such diplomacy. Indeed, when one party violates treaties while the other party complies, the national security and indeed the credibility of the complying party is endangered. Let's talk a bit about declaratory policy, of which there has been some fair amount of comment. NPR 2018 does break from NPR 2010 because it emphasizes the primacy of deterrence rather than the goals of the Prague speech. The Prague speech goals were rejected by all nuclear weapons states except the United Kingdom and the United States, resulting in a more dangerous security environment today than in 2010. Contrary to what people in the United States would have you believe, saying that is not a criticism of the Obama policy. It is a recognition of how the world turned out due to policy set in Moscow, Beijing, Pyongyang, and elsewhere. Second, the declaratory policy clarifies circumstances under which the United States might, and I say and emphasize might, be forced to contemplate the use of nuclear weapons. NPR 2010 says only the U.S. would only consider the use of nuclear weapons in extreme circumstances to defend the vital interests of the United States or its allies and partners. Close quote. That's pretty good public relations policy. That is not particularly good deterrence policy. It does not clarify for potential enemies what we would consider unacceptable. So NPR 2018 contains that sentence about extreme circumstances, and then it expands it. Extreme circumstances could, I emphasize to you, it says could, not do, could include significant non-nuclear strategic attacks. Significant non-nuclear strategic attacks include, but are not limited to, attacks on U.S., allied, or partner civilian population or infrastructure, and attacks on U.S. or allied nuclear forces, their command and control, or warning and attack assessment capabilities. And this provides some very clear warnings as to what types of attacks we would consider unacceptable. It has been interpreted as calling for the use of nuclear weapons to respond to cyber attacks. But it does not say that. And in fact, that notion has been specifically rebutted by senior U.S. officials. You will not find in the document any notion that U.S. nuclear weapons are to be used to deter cyber attacks. Finally, let me turn to two programmatic initiatives proposed in the NPR. For the long term, the NPR, responding to Russian duplicity on the long-standing INF Treaty, calls for exploring the possibility of building a new class of cruise missiles for general-purpose submarines in order to offset any gains Moscow has sought to achieve by deploying its prohibited ground-launched INF systems. The NPR is explicit in stating that if Russia were to return to compliance with its arms control agreements and reduces its non-strategic nuclear arsenal, the U.S. would re-examine the need for the proposed cruise missile. And anyway, we're talking about something beyond 2030. The second initiative, which is designed for rapid implementation, has drawn the most controversy, largely because it has been caricatured and misunderstood. The NPR proposes to modify a small number, I emphasize, a small number, of existing submarine-launched warheads in order that they have significantly reduced yield. This adjustment in our deterrent capability is necessitated by serious concerns about developments in Russian military thinking over the past 10 years. The Russian military has devised a doctrine which envisions using a small number of low-yield nuclear weapons to attack NATO forces defending alliance territory. They have retained former Soviet tactical nuclear systems, which they had pledged to eliminate, and they have deployed new tactical nuclear systems, all of which makes the doctrine credible. And all of this has occurred over the past 10 years or so in the face of our and NATO's existing force structure, leading to the very real concern that the Russian High Command may have come to believe that we lack a credible deterrent to such a low-yield nuclear threat. Modifying a small number of U.S. Trident II warheads will enhance our deterrent capability and will, therefore, be important in dissuading the Kremlin's belief in tactical victories by using low-yield nuclear weapons. The NPR's critics counter this approach by saying that the DoD is seeking to create more usable nuclear weapons. But the NPR explicitly states the opposite. I quote, "Expanding flexible U.S. nuclear options now to include low-yield options is important for the preservation of credible deterrence against regional aggression. To be clear, this is not intended to enable, nor does it enable, nuclear warfighting, nor will it lower the nuclear threshold. Rather, expanding tailored U.S. options will raise the nuclear threshold and help ensure that potential adversaries perceive no possible advantage in limited nuclear escalation, making nuclear weapons employment less likely," end quote. And I'll conclude by pointing out something with respect to the low-yield Trident warhead, which has been largely overlooked in this debate. The United States does not need a low-yield warhead on Trident to deter Russian attack on the United States. This initiative strengthens our ability to deter Russian attack on NATO Europe. It's an undertaking which underscores the American commitment to the defense of the European members of NATO. It's in NATO's interest that this initiative be realized. And the United States deserves both credit and recognition, which it has not received, for re-emphasizing, particularly in these turbulent times, that we are fully committed to Article 5 and to the NATO alliance. So with that, thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
So a couple of things I perhaps should have mentioned at the start of our gathering this morning. The first is, I'm Kori Schake, the Deputy Director the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Second, which I hope you already took from me, which is how very happy I am you are here. The lifeblood of this organization is its membership and the kind of rough and tumble intellectual conversations we have together as we're trying to understand the world. Unlike another think tank around town, who establishes rules by which one cannot quote what's being said at the meetings. Here this morning at Chatham House, we are on the record and we are taping this so that our members who cannot be here can also join in the understanding and in the rough and tumble that we are about to have in this question period. So my thanks to folks who are streaming this subsequently. But now I hope you will join me in giving Frank Miller a traditional Arundel House welcome, by which I mean to say, rough him up with your questions, my friends. That's what we do around here. I will start by saying just a couple of quick things my impressions about the nuclear posture review. First, I'm astonished. That is, I think we had no right to expect it to be anywhere near this good, given the general chaos of the Trump administration. Second, I think I was actually surprised at how good it is on arms control, how much effort it makes to emphasize the importance of the rules, our adherence to the rules, and even in the structuring of the new nuclear forces, that they will be compliant with the rules. I think that actually it really matters that we hold ourselves to standard when so much of our complaint about how the international order is changing is that others are not playing by the rules. I was also struck reading the Nuclear Posture Review at how much it feels the environment has changed and worsened. It's quite a dark document in its assessment of the international order. And whereas the National Defense Strategy that DoD put out 6 months ago is very much focused on the Chinese challenge, this is very much focused on the Russian challenge. And I guess the last thing that I'll say about the Nuclear Posture Review, about what surprised me and is maybe different from other posture reviews, is that it lacks confidence that restrained behavior on the part of the United States produces restrained behavior on the part of others. That, for me, felt like the biggest departure from the Obama-era nuclear posture reviews. Yes. So with that, my friends, pile on, challenge, assert your support for what he's saying, tell him what he's got wrong. Yes, sir, in the front row. Will you please start by, I should have said also, will you please start by saying your name and where you work?
I'm Mahmoud Ali. I'm just a member of this institute. But
no such thing as just a member of this institute, my friend.
I have been for many years, just a member.
Thank you.
I'm a student of US-China relations, and that's the context in which I asked you this question. Thanks for sharing your insights. Obviously, this is a very much more positive take on the NPR than people have read in the newspapers of the last few months. Not just the NPR, but the series of national security documents have highlighted the threat to the United States and its allies from China. And I wonder, given the sort of asymmetry in nuclear arsenal and doctrine between the United States on the one hand and China on the other, the size of the arsenal is very, very different. What is it that drives America's sense of anxiety vis-a-vis China? Why has it come up now? What has changed? And I also wonder, corollary, Dr. Miller, whether the authors of the NPR recognize that just as the United States must ensure its own credible deterrent against vis-a-vis China or Russia, so must China also ensure, with a much smaller arsenal, much weaker infrastructure, whatever it has, ensure some sort of a credible second strike capability, whether that is recognized.
Those are excellent questions.
So I think the first answer is China is on the mind of the authors of the NPR, and I declare an interest. I was involved as an advisor to the NPR. My comments about the Chinese developments is not to criticize the continued maintenance of a second strike capability, but to indicate that for the past 10 years, Russia and China have been very busy, indeed as North Korea, in developing and deploying new systems. All of the talk about the US B-21 bomber and the Columbia-class SSBN is talk about programs which are in the early design phase. As I said before, we won't put anything in the field until the mid to late 2020s. So the point was about the arms race. With respect to China, there have been developments in the past 10 years which clearly cause concern in Washington. The first of those is a more robust emphasis on the notion that the South China Sea is an inland lake, and the whole 9 dashed dotted lines and all that. That is underscored by the creation of artificial islands, which the government in Beijing said would not be militarized. And of course they are militarized, they're quite militarized. It's also reflected in the way that the Chinese Air Force and Navy have been operating in a menacing manner around the Senkaku Islands. And lastly, as I saw yesterday, the Chinese Coast Guard has now been subordinated to the Ministry of Defense, which will make the whole issue of distinguishing between gray hulls and white hulls in regional disputes much more difficult. So with the rise of Chinese military capability, the modernization of their force, and the aggressive intent in trying to enforce an inland waterway where much of the world's ocean traffic passes, there is cause for concern.
I am delighted to see we have so many hands. Matthew Harris, you're up next.
Hi.
Hello, Matt.
Matthew Harris from the Double Analyst, and sorry for walking in late. Thank you very much for talking to us. I have a question, a short question and a short comment disguised as a question. The question is it right to read the introduction of a low-yield warhead for submarine-launched ballistic missile as expressing serious doubt about the penetrating ability of other limited or low-yield options?
Right.
And the comment masquerading as a question is, I share the NPR author's worries about how Russia behaves, and the circumstances in which it might think about limited nuclear use. But where I think I differ is I can't imagine a scenario where Russia uses nuclear weapons in that kind of way that isn't incredibly stupid for Russia to have done so. These scenarios, it seems to me that this is a scenario where Russia is losing a war, and it's a scenario where Russia should have anticipated that it's going to lose a war, and that it's miscalculated horribly. And it seems to me that it's not, to the extent that there is a problem, you can't fix it with a limited nuclear option. You fix it with conventional deployments, with a president who speaks to script on these things, with congressional visits.
And yet those options may not be available.
So what am I missing?
So I think the first point is it would be incredibly stupid for Moscow to initiate aggression, which would then result in nuclear use.
And that the world in which Russia has used a nuclear weapon in this way is a terrible one for Russia. The day after is
all of that's true, but then you look at the doctrine, you look at the weapon systems, including the modernization of those weapon systems, and you look at exercises, which seem to bring it all together. And whatever the Russian military thinks it's doing in that area, the message to Mr. Putin is don't cross the line. Don't cross the line, because as you point out quite correctly, the world's going to get a lot worse. I absolutely support building up NATO's conventional defenses, but this whole scenario begins to play out when NATO begins to really defend itself and stalemate the aggressor force, doesn't it? So building up conventional defense actually, if you follow the scenario logic, increases Russian possibilities for using a nuclear weapon, because they would begin to lose as NATO comes in. If there's no conventional aggression to begin with, that's fine, because all of this is moot. I think the point on the low yield Trident goes like this. NATO and the United States want to be very, very clear that we are not intending or content to have a battlefield nuclear war. That is, that the response to Russian use on the battlefield would not be on the battlefield at all. NATO's DCA have very short legs, which would confine them to operating on the battlefield. If you used air-launched cruise or penetrating system, Russian IAD system, the integrated air defense system, would be relatively intact. The probability to penetrate of a Trident II is 1.0, right? So the point of the low-yield option is to say, if you start something, if you use nuclear weapons first, this is going to escalate. It's going to escalate to Mother Russia. It will go against important but not vital targets, which means the whole thing could get out of hand. And Mr. Putin, are you prepared to gamble the future of the world, to include the future of Russia, for an incursion in the Baltics? And if you're not, tell the military to pack up. Sit down and shut up? Recent phrase. So that's the logic. And again, it's a small number. And you wouldn't use a Trident system on the battlefield, would you? So again, this is an escalatory threat. It's not new, but it does respond to changing conditions because the Russian IAT system is really pretty formidable.
I would simply add that it is historically inaccurate. Pedantic school teacher that I am, I can't resist pointing out that it's historically inaccurate to suggest that because something's dumb to do, somebody won't do it.
You don't have to tell me.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Miller, Lee Willett, former Bruce and James person and now work for himself. Lots of questions potentially, but I'll try and just keep it too short, if I may. The China and North Korea meet this morning and much discussion about North Korea giving up its nuclear weapons. The wording reported in the BBC that I read very quickly, they seem to come out of that says we're prepared to give up our nukes, providing, I'm paraphrasing very broadly, providing that we can have a discussion about this in a manner that relates to all things being peaceful in our giving up their nuclear capability is a very big thing. They're going to want something significant in return for it. What would be your view as that is? What that might be? And the second question, going back to the point about the limited stuff, with the way in which Russia has used force to change international borders in the last few years, since 2008, and with the way in which Russia uses nukes in its exercises very, very early, is there a possibility that what they're trying to say is we're going to march into somewhere we feel like and grab it back, maybe Ukraine, and because we're saying that we can use nukes on day one, we know that looking at your record in Syria, Libya, and not getting involved, you'll stay out. Is there a low-yield nuke deterrent message in what they're doing, what they're trying to say?
Well, I think let's be clear. Whatever one's views of Ukraine or not, the U.S. deterrent applies to NATO and to NATO members, not anywhere else, or to the extent deterrent, the few other states that we cover. We do know that the Russians went on nuclear alert when they invaded Georgia. That's a fact. We do know that Putin suggested that he was prepared to go on nuclear alert when he invaded Crimea and the Donbass. We do know that the Russians have, since about 2008, been using strategic bombers to penetrate air defensive identification zones of many, many NATO countries, including the United States and also Japan. And we've seen statements emanating from senior Russian authorities that sound like Nikita Khrushchev. So the nuclear saber rattling continues, and all of this is the nuclear posture view says we've noted that. It's a really stupid thing to do, to go back to Matt's point. There's no advantage for you in this game. With respect to China, North Korea, I first urge all of you, when you have time, to read the communique, because somewhere living in a cave and now brought back out is someone who's written the most beautiful Chinese communist communique. I mean, it really took me back 30 years as I read that. I mean, it's really an artful piece of work. Look, I have no idea. I have no idea what's in Kim Jong-un's mind, and it would be difficult for me to believe that after all the energy, money, and effort they put into developing nuclear capability, they'll give it up. I mean, would they give it up if the United States withdrew all of its troops from South Korea and said that South Korea was a North Korean protectorate? I have no idea. And I think all of this will unfold in the weeks and months ahead.
If I could add 2 quick points to that. The first is that I think you asked exactly the right question about North Korea, which is what could the United States and its allies possibly offer that the North Koreans would consider a reliable enough assurance of regime survival that they would give up their nuclear weapons? I can't think of what it would be, not even removing American troops from the Korean Peninsula, because something often overlooked in the Korean dynamic is that the South Koreans could win this war. right? The South Korean military is extraordinarily capable, and that we often, because of the close relationship between the United States and South Korea, we often don't look carefully enough at the Korean balance of forces, and it, especially in the last 20 years, very strongly favors South Korea. So I'm not even sure us committing to leave the peninsula and having our allies come in on that side of it would actually make any difference. I think that's the hardest piece of it to crack.
The other question that I think has to be out there is will, notwithstanding Kim Jong-un's ability to mercilessly eliminate opposition, will his generals agree to the denuclearization, given all the effort that's been put into it? I mean, the reports of what they pledged to do have been really muted inside North Korea. So it's very much watch this space. I think it'll be fascinating, and I wouldn't hazard a prediction.
Our Chinese colleague.
Hi, just one quick comment.
I'm sorry, please introduce yourself. For folks
I'm
on.
Shah from Chinese Embassy.
Yes, sir.
Hi, you just talk about the China's activities in South China Sea. I just want to say that the Chinese has been conducting negotiations of the code of conduct in the South China Sea with relevant parties, and hopefully we can come up with something that will further calm down the situation. As for the question, I just want to follow up on the nuclear question on the Korean Peninsula. I don't know whether with the changes of Mr. Tillerson and the coming into power of Mr. Bolton, all these changes will make things more complicated for the meeting between Trump and Kim. And what do you think can come out of that meeting?
That's a very good question for which I would not advance a guess. I mean, President Trump said he would meet with Kim Jong-un. Kim Jong-un said he would meet with President Trump. Let's see what happens. Let's see if the meeting proceeds as was originally conceived without preconditions, or whether one side or the other introduces preconditions which make the meeting difficult to hold. Mr. Bolton's not yet in office, and Mr. Pompeo needs to be confirmed by the U.S. Senate. So, that's a great question, and I'm not going to offer a guess. I'll tell you what I know and what I don't know, but no guessing.
I would only point out that the Secretary of Defense told journalists yesterday that preparations for the meeting were advancing the way they traditionally would in any American administration.
I'm Brigadier Krishnan from the High Commission of Indians. Along the nuclear race has been a two-horse race, and therefore the major agreements have been negotiated between the two nations. With the demonstrated capability of the Chinese to ramp up their capabilities in whatever field they set their mind into, do you find that there's going to be a three-horse race and a more complicated, treaty formulations and implementations thereafter?
Excellent question.
Well, I don't know that it's a two-horse race at this point, because Russia's broken almost every agreement it has signed, with the exception of New START. New START is basically a couple of months old. That situation needs to sort out. The next point is that there is still, even at New START levels, a significant disparity between U.S. and Russian arsenals and the arsenals of all the other nuclear weapon states. The Soviet Union always said that the next round of negotiations had to include British and French forces. And as I recall, Mrs. Thatcher said when U.S. and Russian levels approached Britain's levels, and Britain might consider joining into talks. So again, I think that the gross disparity between the size of the arsenals at this point suggests that if the Russians are prepared to live up to their commitments, we'll be back in the two-horse race again. There is some question about whether or not the New START agreement, which expires in 2021, will be extended for another 5 years. I think that's an interesting question, but I think that discussion is premature. We have 3 years to go, and in my judgment, an undue desire to extend the agreement in the light of what the Russians are doing with every other arms control agreement shows essentially that we don't care that they violate other agreements as long as they're staying with this one. So I'm not looking for a lot of progress in arms control at this time, unless there's a major policy change in Moscow.
Gordon Barris, a member of the Institute.
Excellent.
And answered the right question. 2 points, Frank. One about arms control. Is it going to be possible to work on the basis of past treaties, or are we going to have to think, or are people have to think about a totally different form of arms control, embracing sort of a whole range of weapons, and within that framework letting people decide certain categories? The second question is about ABMs. I wondered if you could say a bit more about the way that plays in American thinking at the moment.
It's hard to. I'm sure one could create entire new ideas about how arms treaties might look, and I think where we've somewhat fallen short of history is that we relaxed the verification requirements that existed in the original START treaty and in the INF treaty when Corey and I were kids, and that's not a good thing. And the Russians have shown them.
Say specifically what the relaxation of verification was, because it's relevant for.
With the INF treaty, there was perimeter portal monitoring of the factories that produced the INF systems, which today are producing mobile ground systems. There was much more intrusive on-the-ground verification, and many more visits, and those have been cut down dramatically. And in part, that leads to concerns about compliance. Arms control should be transparent. That's what the Vienna document was all about. The Russians are very happy to keep violating that all along. So Gordon, I have no idea where arms control is going. And then you talk about exotics. I mean, you talk about boost glide and hypervelocity vehicles. How do you get your hands on that? Particularly if the launch vehicles for those are also strategic nuclear vehicles. I mean, the press suggests that the SS-19, the Russian SS-19, will be the launch vehicle for their conventional hypervelocity vehicle. So arms control has to reflect a change in political attitude, and I don't see that political attitude changing yet. I mean, we can always hope. With respect to ABM, I think a couple of things are worth putting on the table. One is Mr. Putin is now saying that he knew when the U.S. Withdrew from the ABM treaty that arms control was dead. I mean, Corey and I were in the White House at that point. The U.S., as I recall, withdrew from the ABM treaty in December of 2001. And in the spring of 2002, the Treaty of Moscow was signed, which actually cut nuclear forces on both sides deeper than New START. So, the facts of the matter are, whatever he says now, it's not true. That did not impede new arms control efforts. The second thing that I think is factually important, particularly in an institution such as ISS, which is devoted to the facts of military forces around the world, is that there are more Russian interceptors, ABM interceptors deployed around Moscow today than there are on the U.S. West Coast. And we have great confidence in the growing capability of the U.S. THAAD and Aegis systems. The new Russian systems entering the field are pretty damn competent. So it's going to be an issue. In some ways, missile defense is a bit of a religious issue in the United States, if you will, on which battle lines are very strongly drawn. And of course, we're waiting for the administration to come out with its missile defense review, which is the last of the major defense reviews, and that will assess the adequacy of current and planned U.S. systems against current and projected threats. So I think we'll have to wait for that shoe to drop as well.
Thank you. I'm Adil Sultan from King's College. Specific point is thank you for bringing out this clarity. The impression from the NPR is that we can forget about NPT, CTBT, and even
No.
FMCT because the United States has said that they will produce more fissile material for more weapons. Is this impression correct or not? Second, about you talked about tactical nuclear weapons, the low-yield submarine launch. What it is going to do more than what the NATO tactical nuclear weapons couldn't do in that theater? One. The NPR also talked about graduated nuclear response. Does it mean nuclear war fighting? And lastly, do you think these submarine-based capability of low-yield nuclear weapons can be used in other theaters of war apart from NATO? Thank you very much.
Okay. First, on your first point, no. I mean, the document it clearly expresses support for the NPT and says that we will do everything we can to strengthen the NPT. It says that we're going to continue to observe the nuclear test ban moratorium. It says we're not going to submit the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty to the United States Senate. Why? Because it would fail. I mean, the question is it better to say that we're not going to submit it, or to submit it, put a political push forward and have it fail desperately in the Senate, which it will. I mean, the Obama administration talked a big game about supporting the CTBT and didn't submit it to the Senate because it was going to fail. And even if the Senate passed it, which it won't, that doesn't bring the treaty into force. And as far as the fissile material cutoff, I must say that, as I recall, in the 1990s, I went and spoke to the CD on fissile material cutoff. That treaty is going nowhere because a particular state is blocking it. And it will never go anyplace until that particular state stops blocking it. We are not producing more fissile material as such. We are going to modernize the complex that supports our nuclear weapons. Today, Russia, China, and North Korea can produce pits for deployment on their nuclear systems. The United States cannot do that. The pits we produce are experimental only, right? Much of the U.S. infrastructure to support the Department of Energy dates to the Manhattan Project. We actually have nuclear laboratories where there are big nets strung across the ceiling because chunks of concrete are falling down out of the ceiling. So the nuclear weapons infrastructure needs to be refurbished and rehabilitated. With respect to graduated options, as I made clear in my remarks, there is nothing new about graduated options. Go back and read about the Schlesinger Doctrine. Read about the Schlesinger Doctrine. Read about the introduction of small-scale weapons options. In fact, there are documents from the Schlesinger period that have been declassified that explain in extraordinary detail what small options existed back in the 70s. This is nothing new. The United States has always sought to give the president capabilities, any president, capabilities to respond to any potential crisis. With respect to the European weapons, the dual-capable aircraft, as I said to Matt Harries, the aircraft have very short legs. They could only contribute to nuclear use on the battlefield, which we don't intend to do. We do not intend to fight a nuclear war. We do not intend to fight a nuclear war on the battlefield. And so the European-based weapons can't get to the right place, which would be Mother Russia. And they're fourth-generation airplanes. They're very old. They're F-15s and Tornadoes. Against the Russian integrated air defense system, they don't stand much of a chance right now. You know, I mean, they could get there. I'm not saying that the NATO deterrent is not credible. You could get an airplane through, but it would be a very tough thing. So this adds a capability. When the F-35 is fully deployed in Europe, that will have some longer legs and some increased penetration capability. But that doesn't take away from the ability, with a low-yield Trident weapon, to threaten escalation into Russia.
Next up.
Thank you very much. It's Masato Kimura, Japanese journalist,
Yes, sir.
based in London. I'm a member of this institute.
Yay!
Thank you. My question is about North Korea. Do you think Trump administration is tolerate for North Korea to have a nuclear weapon to hit the United States? Some South Korea diplomats said U.S. know the situation but recognize North Korea as a nuclear state, and following the case of Pakistan and India. And the second question is, do you think it is still possible for Trump administration to have a bloody nose options on the North Korea?
So I think the so-called bloody nose option has been roundly dismissed by senior policymakers in the press, publicly. Look, again, as I say, I have no idea where U.S.-North Korea negotiations will lead. I mean, clearly, it is uncomfortable, to say the least, that North Korea can threaten our allies in South Korea and Japan with nuclear missiles, and today can threaten at least the American base at Guam and potentially Hawaii, and sooner rather than later, unless changed, the U.S. homeland itself. But where those negotiations lead, as I've said before, I'm not going to guess. I don't know.
Next up.
Christina Baylis with Kinetic. Two questions, if I may. First one, even if the NPR precludes the use or denies any intent to use low-yield nuclear weapons, what is your view about the future of usable nukes in terms of having any role to play in the future security system? And the second question, if we reflect on the concept of nuclear deterrence, do you think that its meaning and utility has unchanged, has not changed, it's the same, or we should probably be rethinking what we mean with nuclear deterrence against the much more complex world?
So that's a great question. The answer to the first question is bifurcated. It's twofold. One is we use nuclear weapons every day to deter attack against ourselves and our allies. Two, I do not believe that nuclear weapons are usable warfighting weapons. The NPR is clear. It quotes the NATO summit statement from Warsaw from 2016 that any use of a nuclear weapon would represent a fundamental change in the character of warfare. And that means that nuclear weapons should not be used. They exist to deter nuclear attack and major conventional attack on ourselves and our allies. So I do not buy into any theory of nuclear warfighting. And again, the document makes clear that what we are doing is designed to raise the nuclear threshold and convince the political leadership in Russia, regardless of the options being presented to them by the military, the answer is don't go to war. Nuclear deterrence is an uneasy business. No one's particularly happy with it. But the fact of the matter is that we have had a nuclear-free world. That's the world that existed between the beginning of history in 1945. If you look at just European history alone, in the 300 years between the Treaty of Westphalia, when the modern nation state was created, and the end of World War II, the great powers of Europe went to war with each other on average 7 times a century, counting the Napoleonic Wars as one war and the Wars of Italian liberation as one war. That stopped after 1945, didn't it? The great powers have not gone to war with each other after 1945. The nuclear armed states have acted towards each other with greater caution than they would have acted without nuclear weapons. Does that mean that accidents can't happen? No. Does that mean that peace is assured? No. But we seem to have stumbled on a mechanism which has produced peace between and among the great powers for the longest period of time in modern recorded history. So yeah, I think nuclear deterrence is going to continue in some way, manner, or form. You can imperil it by stretching it to cover events which are not credible. You can imperil it by causing your adversary to doubt your will or your capability or both. But again, the posture view, at least in the United States and for our allies, is designed to ensure that our capability and our will and our intent is clear.
Desmond Burton, I'm a consulting member of the Institute.
Yay!
Frank, let me upbraid you for your less than enthusiastic endorsement of the NATO European DCA.
You should. You're right. I went too far. You're right. You're right. I accept that. I accept that bollocking. Yes.
So there is, and DCA play an enormously important role in burden sharing,
Yep.
and the commitment of European allies to a nuclear.
Right.
But the question that I have is whether, as a low-yield US Trident capability comes in, and it'll be a bit of time before that happens, what are the implications of that for B-61 bombs in Europe and DCA?
You're right to correct me, and I accept that. So first let me say that the DCA play two roles. There's a deterrence role and there is an assurance role. And there is, in the broader political sense in the alliance, the burden sharing and risk sharing role. And those are invaluable. And I think that in the current political climate in the United States, the continued willingness of European nations to risk share and burden share is of great importance. And I think that the aircraft, as I say, with F-35 coming in, the capability will be increased. The B-61-12 is essential because the existing bombs based in Europe are products of the 60s with vacuum tubes and other flaws that need to be replaced. The Trident low-yield option, if funded by the Congress, could be fielded within 2 years. And again, it's a very small number of weapons. And we hope that happens. But you're absolutely right to correct me. I don't mean to demean the DCA force, which I have fought for years, decades, I think, to maintain.
Last question, Ben.
I'm Ben Barry, I'm the staff here at the ISS. I didn't get from my reading of the review of your talk a sense of how the US sees its allies' deterrence, the French and the British. I think this is particularly important for the British because recent reports have revealed that owing to jaw-dropping cost escalation, the renewal of the British deterrent threatens to eat quite a lot of conventional capability.
I think the report makes passing reference to the British and French deterrence. It's been the policy of the U.S. government, this administration included, to support fully the modernization of the British deterrent. We view the second center of decision-making as being absolutely essential. The cost of the deterrent is one that comes every 20 or 30 years or so in a cyclical fashion. I have argued, and I will continue to argue, that if you're going to be spending that amount of money on a deterrent, the British Trident makes people in Moscow think much more than an additional brigade. Moscow can always produce more brigades, but the notion of a deterrent response is something that they can't stop. And so I think the United States is foursquare behind the British deterrent. We are co-developing the missile compartment with the United Kingdom. That relationship continues. And again, I think that the British deterrent is absolutely essential. The French deterrent is a horse of a different color, but NATO declarations, and I think this document makes passing reference to the fact that they play a role in a different manner than the British deterrent. But I would say that, yes, I mean, it's gobbling up money now, but it's gobbling up money which is being well spent.
So my friends, on that note, I want to thank you for coming out this morning. The International Institute for Strategic Studies, under John Chipman's superb direction, it produces policy-relevant data and analyses on the causes, course, and consequences of war. We convene policymakers at very high levels to provide institutional connections where they don't exist. And we thank you for contributing your talent and your reputations to that effort. Thank you. Won't you join me in thanking Frank Miller for coming to talk with us?